Lewis Hamilton blazes to yet another. Wait. Lewis Hamilton limps to a 7th victory at his home race at Silverstone. Valtteri Bottas faces his misfortune again with a last lap puncture as a fast and furious pair of young drivers Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc fill up the podium. This, apart from the beginning and the end, was a pretty boring race. Like, if somebody wanted to know why there were regulation changes happening in F1, this race could be the perfect example. With that said, welcome to the second episode of Fueled with Prakhar. Now, we've reached the good news, bad news moment, as in where should we start this whole episode with the good part or the bad part, and usually I like the dessert first, but this time I'm going to go with the course, the main course, get it? Alright. Now, let's have the veggies before the dessert this time. Let me rank in my personal opinion the drivers that had the worst weekend at Silverstone. Valtteri Bottas, Kevin Magnussen, Carlos Sainz Jr., Sebastian Vettel, and Daniel Kvyat. Yeah. If the start of the previous race at Hungaroring at the Styrian GP was bad fuel, gotta stop. Well, then this race's end was fire to that fuel for Bottas. Really ironical. I mean, such a good 51 laps, and right before you're about to finish with P2, or second place, your omen returns. Valtteri had done so well in this otherwise boring race. He had a brilliant start, almost had Lewis in the beginning, fended off and kept Verstappen at a really good distance. Yet everything, every inch of his focus, hard work, dedication, all set to waste when he finished without points at P11. He faced a puncture, and that too not just any puncture, at the last lap, right after he passed the pit lane. If he had gotten that puncture right before the pit lane, he could have just pitted, and he wouldn't have finished as bad. I mean, he could have still been on the podium. But, well, the omen returns when it does. And if you're still stuck at why fending off Max Verstappen is a big deal or a big achievement, well, watch his last race and watch why he was really driver of the day for the fans. Things went so bad for Bottas that he couldn't even finish or overtake Sebastian Vettel. He couldn't finish ahead of him. Sebastian Vettel himself ranks 4th in our top 5 worst driver weekends list. Bottas drove really well. After every safety car, he tried really hard to overtake Hamilton. He was P2 constantly. I mean, he was just driving amazing, phenomenally, really well. He's just a very consistent driver overall. If you give him, if he's not under pressure, which I think he'll handle better if he starts winning, but if he is not under much pressure, he just does amazing for the team as a whole and as a driver by himself. Although this P11 finish, because of that puncture, that last lap puncture, has put Bottas 30 points behind Hamilton in the championship points. If it was someone else, I'd say there's lots of races to look forward to, but since it's Hamilton, I really think this title is going to be very hard to snatch from him. Although Bottas has extended his partnership with Mercedes with a new contract, so hey, it's not all that bad. I believe it's a time to showcase his cool and calm Finnish self, much like another Finn on the grid, and not crack under pressure. Bottas is currently on repeat from last year, where he cracked under pressure and was out right after winning the first race. I mean, in 2018, Hamilton and Vettel were very closely fighting for championship. Yup, it's true. It was all true until their race at Germany. Hamilton's car couldn't reach the pits. He literally even pushed it, and his qualifying was done. He didn't have a car to participate in qualifying for. That was a very sad moment. I think Hamilton was almost crying. He didn't take his helmet down. He just leaned on his car and looked down. Bad luck, right? Well, that didn't stop Hamilton, though. He took victory from 14th on the grid, as an excited / under pressure Vettel made a big mistake. He even cried after that. I think Bottas could make a similar comeback, especially because he's in a Mercedes. It was Kevin Magnussen next who had it going not so well by the second lap of the race. In fact, Magnussen had a really bad weekend overall, just like Haas F1 team themselves. I mean, he started 14th on the grid, Magnussen was shunted into by a fast-paced Alex Albon, who was then handed a 5-second time penalty. And while I do understand the reasoning behind that penalty, I still think it was a bit too harsh, just like many other people. What I fail to understand, though, is why are Haas drivers so aggressive? I mean, Romain Grosjean was handed a black and white flag because he was moving under braking when Carlos Sainz Jr. was trying to pass him. It just seemed like he was a very frustrated and irritated driver with yet another midfield team crossing him over. And, well, McLaren have done really well, so when it's time, you have to give the respect and space to that other fast-paced driver who's constantly and consistently doing better than you. But as always, Haas drivers are way too aggressive. I mean, they collide into themselves. And now, even with Kevin's case, I mean, just think about it. Red Bull and Alex Albon is a deadly combination. He's a teammate to Max Verstappen, who potentially had the chance of a world title. And he still does. I mean, who knows, maybe even Alex does next year. That's a superior driver and a much superior car. And you're trying to cut them off on the outside when Alex is already on a curb. So he hit the curb, the car was not in his control, and then just slid right under the right rear tire of Magnussen, who was then shunted out of the race. I mean, if they just could finish the race with the two cars, it would mean a lot for Haas. I think they are failing, the drivers are failing to understand this part. They think that if they are beyond the points, I think it's just really nice to go aggressive and all in because, well, they're not anyways going to have any points. So even if they're out of the race, it's not going to matter, but it will. I mean, the team has to spend a lot of money to get the car back on track. With really hard times like these in COVID, it's hard to get more sponsors, especially for a team and driver like yours. If you just started to think in a long-term perspective, a more comprehensive perspective, that you have to finish the race with both the drivers so that they can then start to consistently improve the car and then maybe start finishing in the points, it could work out. It's a driver mentality that needs to be focused upon. Moreover, I do think there's very little camaraderie in the team. I mean, you were just out of the race after lap 2. What does the team get to know about the car's performance? Nothing. They have to wait until the next race to figure out if there are any problems which could have been solved by this next race. It's kind of hard to accept that nowadays in F1, especially when this year the competition is getting so fierce in the midfield because, well, Ferrari has entered the midfield. And we move on to Carlos Sainz Jr. And, well, my tone is mellow and sad and sorrow because I really like this driver. He gave one hell of a competition to Charles Leclerc, who's going to be his teammate from next year, at the start of the race when Charles Leclerc is in a Ferrari and he's in a McLaren, which is, well, if you don't know the difference between the two cars, you should. Secondly, Carlos drove amazingly well. He was ahead at P5, right when at the last lap, just like Valtteri Bottas, he had a puncture and he finished quite some places down. From being P5, having so much points and, well, followed by his teammate, he now finished P13 and out of points. And it was just a bad race for them. He started off pretty good. It was really going good for him. The entirety of the race, he was very consistent. He was constantly pushing. He was very competitive. He's genuinely a good driver. He's a very good person overall when you get to see him in the fan meets and the jokes and everything. And suddenly these kinds of things happen to a driver like Carlos Sainz. It's really heartbreaking to watch F1 because this is just completely, it's not under anyone's control. Of course, the drivers have to manage the tires, but this, out of nowhere, just right away, a puncture is way too much, especially on the last lap. Like a few more kilometers and you would have been through with the race. Something like what happened with Lewis Hamilton, but hey, that's what you got to deal with. And let's just swiftly move on to the next one, the not-so-swift Sebastian Vettel. This year has completely been bad for him. This year has taken its fair share of toll on Vettel. I mean, amidst all of these rumors of him retiring, people already expecting him to, some wanting him to move to Aston Martin and whatnot, I think he's holding up pretty fine because constantly his car is not able to give him adequate performance. His teammate, who's a much younger driver, who has all the golden things from Ferrari, who's the number one driver suddenly for Ferrari, is getting all of the good stuff. And Sebastian is just feeling left out. That's what I think. He's just underconfident and he's not able to compete at the level that you would expect him to. I mean, he couldn't even fight off Alex Albon At the end, Valtteri Bottas was about to overtake him. Fortunately, he was not able to. Fortunately for Vettel, not really for Bottas, because he deserved a better position. But anyway, so did Sebastian Vettel. I mean, that's a 4-time world champion we're talking about, and to see him like that at every race, it's really hard. It's really heartbreaking for F1 fans overall as well. And moving on to the last one, the Russian driver Daniil Kvyat. I mean, it was a pretty bad race for him. What happened with him was not exactly his fault because there were lots of winds and tail ends of the car was, well, moving a lot. I mean, Kimi Räikkönen was constantly complaining about it. He was complaining about other things as well to his engineer, but let's not talk about that. And there's something wrong with the front left for sure this year, because at the Hungaroring also the front left was just not too good. And in this race as well, we saw a dramatic end when 3 cars faced tyre punctures of the front left. So it was a pretty bad one. The crash was really, really bad. I mean, he shunted into the barriers really hard. It was very similar to what happened with Robert Kubica. Obviously, the cars are much more safer now, and this is exactly what needs to be shown to people who believe what exactly has really changed with the safety of the cars. Well, this has. You remember Robert Kubica's accident and what happened to him, and you see Daniil Kvyat, he was completely fine. In fact, he was apologizing for what happened with the car. I don't really think it was his fault. I think it was more to do with what exactly was going on with the tires and the winds and the track itself. But hey, he's a much more responsible driver now. He apologizes for these things. He's no more the torpedo. And yeah, I think he's soon going to get that invitation, that party invitation from Vettel. And now let's move on to the dessert part, the racers that had a really good race. And of course, I'm going to have to start it with Lewis Hamilton. He secured his 7th victory at his home Grand Prix, which is another record. And he basically limped through the finish line as he finished 5.8 seconds ahead of Max Verstappen. Hamilton, just like his teammate Valtteri Bottas, got a last lap tyre puncture, but his was quite lucky because it was not too far off from the race. He could have just basically pitted and got the tyre changed. And it was astonishing to watch, even for the commentators, because even they were wondering, why is he not pitting? Because right behind him was Max Verstappen, who was somewhere to the north of 30 seconds behind. So he could have easily managed a pit stop and still won. But he decided to continue. It was a very risky move. I was really, really shocked that Mercedes did something like that, especially when I was talking so good about their strategies in the last episode. I mean, Mercedes could have easily pulled this one off, but they didn't. At one point of time, I think 2 or 3 turns before the end of the race, Hamilton was almost not able to stop his car. And I was like, please don't get a DNF. Please don't do it. That would be bad. A P2 would still be fine. But if Hamilton gets a DNF because of not stopping for a tyre change, that would be horrifying. Fortunately for Hamilton, it was a really lucky race. He finished 5.8 seconds ahead of Max Verstappen and secured P1 at his home Grand Prix. Now, I'm not going to claim or give all of the credit of Hamilton's victory to his good luck. I mean, the guy really was flying through the entirety of the race. He was 30 seconds ahead of Max Verstappen. So definitely, he had worked really hard to achieve to that point, to reach that point where he could just basically limp across the finish line, and that to P1. Max was catching up so fast. It was 2-3 seconds were going on just like that. And still Hamilton was able to, carve out a victory. So it wasn't entirely luck. I think it was also to do with how ahead he was and how much he planned and did on the weekends and qualifying and the race as well, for the entirety of the race. Something that goes unnoticed from Hamilton is his consistency. He's really consistent. He's really good. When he's ahead, he's not cracking under pressure. There's lots of things that he does when he's ahead, maintaining his tires, giving a lot of feedback. So I think we should give credit where it's due, but obviously he got very lucky. The next person who had a really good race was Max Verstappen, and he quite usually, obviously, always does. He just flies through. He's a really good driver. Max secured P2 right after Bottas had that unfortunate tyre puncture. He just grabbed that position. In fact, he was gunning for Hamilton. Maybe, just maybe, if the race was just about half a kilometre longer, we could have seen swapped places between Hamilton and Verstappen. Fortunately for Hamilton, that didn't happen. Now, everyone believes that Red Bull made a bad strategic call, a bad decision when they decided to pit Verstappen in right when Hamilton had a tyre puncture. They could have just gone by. They didn't need to. I do not concur with that. I believe they made a very smart call. I mean, Verstappen was having a really bad time, a really hard time with his front left. They saw what happened with both the Mercedes cars. They didn't want that to happen to them because then the entire race would be ruined. So instead of having a low probability, a low chance of winning this race, they wanted 100% assurance that they get P2, which was right there in their hands now. So I think that was a really smart strategic move. Max obviously flies through. He obviously just gives a really good performance. He almost all the time is just giving out such a good performance at such a young age that he seems to be too mature. He's giving championship winning vibes right now. And I think this has to be his best year. The way he's performing right now with Red Bull, I think it's defining. It's a career-defining moment. It's a career-defining time for him. And I think he should be consistent for it. Obviously, following Bottas's unfortunate tyre puncture, Charles Leclerc also got to the podium. He was P4, quite a lot behind Verstappen because he couldn't catch him even when Verstappen pit. But it was a really good race because he just got onto the podium, which was seeming to be, well, not really possible. Not seeming to be, it was just impossible for him to get there. So it was a pretty good race. But an even better race was for Daniel Ricciardo, who he could finally see himself at P4. He must have been reminded of his old days with Red Bull because he drove really well. I'm really excited to watch Daniel Ricciardo in a McLaren with a Mercedes engine next year. He is going to be a threat to a lot of people. He has been a great driver. He wants to win the championship. He has that hunger. He has the raw talent. And I think he's gunning for it. He's trying to prove a lot of things. And so are Renault. I mean, Renault was not really... let's just say Renault was not really pleased with what Daniel Ricciardo did with his decision to switch. So I think they're just trying to prove how much they really are worth. And Cyril Abiteboul is going to be really happy with that P4. Ricciardo had started at 8th on the grid. I mean, he was behind Carlos Sainz, he was behind Lando Norris for the entirety of the race. And then, well, he took up positions. And right after Carlos Sainz Jr. had that unfortunate tyre puncture, just like Valtteri Bottas and Lewis Hamilton, Daniel Ricciardo was the first one to grab that opportunity when Lando Norris was being told that something really terrible had happened to his teammate. So I think kudos to Daniel Ricciardo. It was a really good race for him. Okay, so before I bring an end to this rather short episode, let me direct your attention towards a few things. Firstly, Racing Point. I mean, Racing Point had a pretty bad weekend. Nico Hülkenberg couldn't start. Sergio Perez already had COVID-19. And Lance Stroll was shown a black and white flag when he was maneuvering under braking. It was a pretty bad weekend. The pink Mercedes didn't really look like a Mercedes. It looked like it was really hard to manage that car, especially for Lance Stroll. Talking about Hülkenberg, I think my heart aches every time I see that guy. That guy is a Le Mans winner and he has never been on the podium. Never been on the podium of F1. He's been almost for a decade now. I think he still holds that record and he's never been on the podium. I was really hoping to see him there because of how a Racing Point car was performing, but, well, no luck. I just hope next weekend he still stays and we get to see him on the podium. Now, directing attention towards one last thing, which is Lando Norris. During the end laps, when everyone was facing, including Lewis Hamilton, Valtteri Bottas, Carlos Sainz, his teammate, everyone had that tyre puncture. Lando Norris was told to switch to scenario 7, which is sort of a code language, and I'm guessing that code language meant full power or full throttle, to which he responded, no. He straight up denied it. He said, no, Ricciardo is much quicker, there is no chance we catch him. He must have had this thought in his mind that the front left is not performing really well. If he switches to that, he could face a similar situation to his teammate, Carlos Sainz. He was at P6, he didn't want to lose that. He got to P5 because of his teammate's tyre puncture, and he said that was a really mature decision. In fact, when Ricciardo overtook Lando Norris, and both Norris and Carlos Sainz were ganging up on him, it was also very clean. I mean, Lando Norris took his position back, and even when he was fighting Carlos, he was so clean, it was so mature, unlike Kevin Magnussen, or any other Haas F1 driver, that's Romain Grosjean, who's so aggressive and they usually get shunted out or shunt somebody else and gain some penalty points or whatever. I think that's something you definitely need to look at in a driver. And he's just 20 years old, so with more experience, he's just going to get better with that. Anyway, this was all for this episode. I hope that you will see me in the next one. In case it comes up in your feed or you've subscribed, I'm not going to shove it down your throat this time. Genuinely. No jokes. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye. Cheers.